The winter of 1943 carved its own kind of battlefield across the outskirts of Leningrad, an icy frontier where men disappeared as completely as footprints in snow. Few outside specialist circles remember that during this period, small Allied liaison teams quietly operated beside Soviet forces. They were not frontline battalions, nor headline-making armored divisions, but compact groups tasked with observing, reporting, and surviving in one of the harshest theaters of the war. Among them was a British attachment known as the 30 Mission Liaison Platoon, 16 men who would soon march into a landscape where the enemy was only half the threat. The winter itself would be the other. As January 1943 drew to a close, the Soviet Red Army managed what many believed impossible. They fractured the German stranglehold that had kept Leningrad under siege for nearly 900 days. The city still starved, but at last a narrow land corridor was open. Amid that fragile breakthrough, the British War Office and the Royal Navy sought more accurate intelligence on German withdrawal patterns, information vital for protecting Arctic convoys approaching Murmansk. To gather it, the platoon under Captain Arthur Mallory was ordered to link with the Soviet 55th Army and proceed southeast toward Lake Ladoga. Their mission sounded routine for liaison units: observe German rearguard routes, coordinate with Soviet scouts, and relay anything unusual back to command. But nothing about this sector was routine. German units in the area included elements of the 170th Infantry Division and scattered detachments of the 96th Infantry Regiment, seasoned troops well practiced in controlled retreats and sudden counterattacks. Entire forests were strung with mines and booby traps, and villages changed hands in the span of hours. Even more dangerous was the weather, which shifted from clear skies to lethal whiteouts without warning. When Mallory's platoon set out on January 30th, temperatures were already plunging below -25°C, and wind-driven snow sometimes limited visibility to less than 50 meters. The men advanced alongside a small Soviet reconnaissance group led by Lieutenant Sergei Danilov, a veteran of winter operations who warned them early. Around Ladoga, the snow is not your friend. It hides everything: holes, men, and death. Mallory recorded Danilov's words in his notebook, adding a clipped margin note: navigating terrain will be slow. Risk of disorientation high. His tone remained disciplined, but even he recognized the precariousness of the mission. The journey toward the village of Voibokolo took them over frozen marshland and through narrow forest trails where branches cracked sharply in the cold. Occasionally the British operators paused to listen. Was that ice shifting, or boots? The sound difference mattered. German patrols were known to move silently until the last possible moment, and their defensive fallback lines were still fluid. Every new mile carried the platoon deeper into an area where maps were unreliable and enemy positions changed daily. Despite these challenges, the liaison team reached Voibokolo on February 2nd. Once a farming settlement, it was now little more than scorched timber, shattered windows, and half-buried trenches. Soviet officers stationed there delivered troubling reports. German rearguard actions had intensified as the Wehrmacht attempted to maintain control of nearby transport routes. Scouts described flashes of movement in the nearby Tree-Line, too disciplined to be retreating civilians, too brief to confirm as German troops. The uncertainty weighed heavily on the British platoon. With aircraft grounded by heavy cloud cover, Mallory depended entirely on wireless communication. Their radio operator, Corporal Evelyn Roth, established a tenuous connection with Leningrad headquarters late that night. Her log entry noted, "Signal weak, interference continuous, likely caused by both atmospheric conditions and German jamming." Still, one final coherent message was transmitted. The platoon reported noticing unexpected movement at 210 degrees arc, possibly German scouts observing village perimeter. No further clarification followed. Snow began to fall in thick, swirling sheets, and the Soviet scouts urged the men to remain sheltered until daylight. But Mallory's training and his duty pushed him to investigate the Tree-Line at first light. He wrote a brief message in his notebook before bedding down: "If enemy preparing counterattack, must confirm direction before we lose visibility entirely." He never wrote another line. The stage was set for a convergence of hazards: shifting battle lines, a vulnerable reconnaissance unit, and one of the worst storms of the winter. The British platoon had arrived at Voibokolo, but their next steps were shrouded in uncertainty. The storm outside was building, pressing against wooden walls, rattling doors, and swallowing sound. Within hours, it would erase the landscape itself. And somewhere just beyond the tree line, someone, or something strictly human, was already watching. The next day would push Captain Mallory and his men deeper into a mystery no intelligence briefing had prepared them for, and from which no clear trail would ever emerge. At dawn on February 2, 1943, the village of Wojbokolo lay under a silence that felt heavier than the snowfall itself, an oppressive quiet that often precedes sudden violence on the Eastern Front. To the British liaison platoon stationed there overnight, that silence carried a warning. Captain Arthur Mallory stepped outside into the pre-dawn haze, listening for anything that might betray German movement. The crunch of boots, the clatter of equipment, even the distant mechanical rhythm of an engine. Instead, the only sound was wind pushing against the charred ruins of the village. In this stillness, it was easy to forget how quickly the front could shift, how rapidly safety could become a trap. The previous night's report about unexpected movement in the tree line hung uneasily over the platoon. Mallory knew Wojbokolo's position, just southeast of Lake Ladoga, placed them along one of the most contested withdrawal corridors for the German 170th Infantry Division. The Wehrmacht had every reason to delay Soviet advances while reorganizing their defenses. Small German scout units often approached villages like this before dawn, probing for weaknesses or surveying Soviet activity. Yet the British had seen nothing definite, only shadows moving between snow-laden birch trees. Sergeant Benjamin Harrow, Mallory's second-in-command, gathered the men after a meager breakfast of hard biscuits and lukewarm tea. Danilov's scouts will sweep the tree line first, Harrow told them. We follow once they signal clear. Keep radios warm, rifles dry, and eyes open. In the bitter cold, weapons jammed easily, and batteries died without warning. Corporal Evelyn Roth wrapped the radio in an extra wool layer, checking the aerial twice before attempting another transmission. Her connection to Leningrad was already worse than the previous night. Static filled the line like a crashing tide, drowning her coded message. Roth tried again, adjusting frequencies, tapping out the sequence with gloved hands stiff from the cold. Finally, a faint acknowledgement crackled through, barely legible. Copy, storm building, maintain position. The message was the last stable communication the platoon would receive. By mid-morning, the temperature plunged again, and the first gusts of wind signaled an incoming front. Soviet scouts returned with conflicting observations. One claimed he saw fresh boot tracks, German issue, leading deeper into the forest, though drifting snow obscured the direction. Another insisted he heard mechanical rattling, possibly a machine gun team repositioning. But no one saw the enemy directly. It was as if the forest concealed an invisible hand shifting pieces across a board neither army could fully read. Mallory made his decision. The platoon would investigate cautiously. They moved in a tight column behind Danilov's scouts, rifles at the ready, breath forming thick vapor clouds. Every few meters, Harrow paused to scan the trees. A cluster of broken branches suggested someone had passed recently, too recently for natural causes. In the white landscape, even the smallest clue felt significant. Yet each time they thought they were closing on a trail, the wind buried it again. The storm descended faster than anticipated. What began as light snow shifted into a blinding curtain of white, forcing the British and Soviet team to huddle behind a ridge for temporary shelter. Lieutenant Danilov removed his cap, shaking ice from its brim. If we lose visibility, he warned, we lose direction. And if we lose direction out here, we may not find our way back. This wasn't hyperbole. During winter operations around Leningrad, soldiers frequently became disoriented in wideouts and stumbled into enemy lines, or off frozen marshland that could collapse under weight. Mallory considered turning back, but the lingering evidence of German scouts pushed him forward. If a rearguard unit was preparing a trap for Soviet forces, confirming their location was vital. We push another half-mile, he ordered. If we see nothing, we fall back. They never made it that far. Within minutes, the storm intensified to a near-total whiteout. Snow whipped against their faces like shards of glass. Danilov signaled halt, shouting over the wind that the forest path had vanished. Hero tried to regroup men who had drifted apart in the confusion. The radio crackled relentlessly, but produced no coherent message. The snowstorm, later identified in meteorological logs as one of the strongest that winter, swallowed sound, shape, and perspective. They could barely see each other's outlines. And then, faintly through the roar of wind, someone heard it, a single burst of gunfire. The sound came from somewhere ahead, maybe 50 meters, maybe 5. Hard to tell in the storm. The Soviet scouts froze, unsure whether the shot was a warning, an ambush, or simply an echo warped by the wind. Hero shouted for confirmation, but the storm devoured his voice. Mallory raised his hand, signaling the platoon to regroup and prepare to withdraw. But before they could consolidate, the storm surged again, driving snow in thick, suffocating waves that forced them to crouch and shield their eyes. Moments later, another troubling realization emerged. 2 members of the British platoon were suddenly unaccounted for. Whether they drifted off course, followed a false silhouette, or moved toward the sound of the gunshot, no one could say. In the blizzard, even a few steps in the wrong direction meant disappearing into a world of white. As the storm closed in around them, Captain Mallory felt the first true edge of fear, not of the enemy, but of the overwhelming possibility that nature, not gunfire, would consume his men before the day was done. The mystery of that gunshot, and the vanishings that followed, would haunt every decision he made next. For soldiers on the Eastern Front, the weather was often a more lethal adversary than any rifle or artillery piece. Yet even by those standards, the storm that struck the Voivokolo sector on February 3, 1943, was exceptional. A violent white tempest that would later be documented in Soviet meteorological logs as the deadliest blizzard of that winter. It arrived with a force that transformed the land into a shifting void, where direction, sound, and distance dissolved into a single blinding haze. For Captain Arthur Mallory's British liaison platoon, already stretched thin and searching for 2 missing men, the storm became an enemy they could neither evade nor predict. By mid-afternoon, visibility had collapsed. Shapes vanished within a few meters. The British and Soviet teams attempted to maintain formation, but the storm shredded their cohesion. Lieutenant Danilov tried shouting commands, but his voice dissolved into the howl of the wind. What had begun as a careful reconnaissance had devolved into a desperate attempt simply to stay together. The forest, their only point of reference, became a featureless blur. Mallory walked at the head of the staggered column, wiping ice from his goggles every few seconds. Snow clung to his coat in thick crusts. His notebook, heavily used until the previous evening, now remained sealed in his pocket. There was no point in writing. The storm was rewriting the landscape faster than any man could record it. "We stay close," he yelled to Hero, though the words came out muffled. "No wandering. No scouting ahead." Hero nodded, slinging his rifle over his shoulder while trying to keep eyes on the silhouettes behind him. Yet despite their efforts, the storm seemed determined to peel them apart piece by piece. A sudden gust tore through the group, forcing Mallory to crouch and brace himself. When he looked up moments later, the 2 Soviet scouts who had been 10 paces ahead were gone. Whether they veered off the path or were swallowed in a swirl of drifting snow was impossible to tell. Danilov attempted to follow their trail, but each boot print filled instantly, erasing any trace of direction. Snowstorms around Ladoga were notorious for this, what scouts called the white curtain, a natural eraser that left no clue of where a man had walked only seconds earlier. The platoon had experienced storms before, but nothing this disorienting. The temperature continued falling, and frostbite became an immediate threat. Every breath felt sharp, metallic. The wind roared against their clothing with such force that several men struggled to stay upright. Corporal Roth kept the radio close to her chest, the aerial trembling as static overwhelmed every channel. She attempted transmission after transmission, but the storm's electromagnetic interference rendered the device nearly useless. The radio's faint crackle was the only confirmation that Leningrad headquarters still existed somewhere beyond the blizzard. Hours passed, though no one could measure them. Daylight dimmed behind a wall of ice and cloud. The men moved in tightening circles, trying to stay within sight of one another, but the blizzard pressed them relentlessly toward confusion and panic. Mallory's priority shifted from reconnaissance to survival. "We break for shelter," he tried to signal to Danilov. But shelter was a concept, not a destination. Everything around them was white. Then came an unnerving sound, one that did not belong to the storm. A distant, rhythmic thumping. Too regular to be wind. Too faint to identify. "Artillery," Roth whispered. Danilov shook his head. "No. Wrong echo." The noise repeated, a dull cadence that seemed to move laterally across the treeline, though in the blizzard direction meant little. Some believed it was German boots crunching through the ice. Others suspected it was branches snapping under the weight of snow. The uncertainty gnawed at them. In conditions like these, even small illusions could lead men fatally astray. The storm's pressure increased, forcing the group into single file again. Hero counted heads every few minutes, murmuring names into the storm. Reynolds, Kent, Parker, reassuring himself that at least some order remained. But each time he completed a count, he started over, unsure whether he had missed someone. Just before dusk, the storm reached its peak. Snow drove horizontally, stinging like needles. The earth beneath them shifted as drifts rose and collapsed. The platoon huddled behind a partially fallen pine, using it as a meager windbreak. Mallory tried once more to raise headquarters. Roth pressed her frozen hands around the transmitter. A burst of sharp static cracked through. Then something else, almost a voice. Mallory leaned in. "Say again. Leningrad, say again." The radio spat a garbled fragment, barely audible beneath the storm's fury. "Fire, south, movement. Unidentified." Then the signal died completely. "Movement south," Danilov repeated, thinking aloud. "Unidentified. Could be Germans. Or our missing men," Hero countered. The storm offered no clarification. Night fell without warning. The blizzard gave no indication it would loosen its grip. Mallory realized they were entirely cut off from the world. No visibility, no reliable bearings, no communication, and no guarantee their missing men were even alive. Somewhere in the whiteness, gunfire had sounded earlier. Somewhere to the south, something was moving, German, Soviet, or otherwise. Records would later show that this area was unpatrolled by any official Soviet unit during those hours. But in the storm, none of the British could know that. The platoon huddled closer, their breaths freezing in the air between them. The storm had taken the land, the sky, and the trail. Now it threatened to take their cohesion. As the wind screamed through the ruined forest, Mallory faced a dreadful realization. They had entered a blizzard that erased more than tracks. It erased men. And by morning, more of his would be gone. When the storm finally broke on the morning of February 4, 1943, it did not fade gently. It simply ceased, abruptly, unervingly, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt unnatural. The world that emerged from the blizzard was unrecognizable. What had once been forest trails were now rolling dunes of snow. What had been visible treelines were now half-buried silhouettes. Captain Arthur Mallory's British liaison platoon, battered and exhausted, took stock of their surroundings with a mix of relief and dread. The storm had ended. But so too had any certainty about where they stood, or how many of their men remained. Mallory ordered a quick regroup. Sergeant Hero tallied the survivors, his voice trembling slightly as he called out names. Danilov's remaining scouts stood a short distance away, scanning the treeline with the wary expression of men who had seen too many disappear into storms like this. When the count concluded, the result was stark. The platoon was no longer 16 men strong. 4 were gone. 2 lost the previous day, swallowed in the storm before the worst hit. 2 more vanished during the night, perhaps drifting from the small shelter of the fallen pine, perhaps pulled by hallucinations brought on by cold and exhaustion. But what unsettled the men most was not the missing. It was the landscape itself. Every trace of their prior movement, every boot track, Every dragged branch, every sign of struggle, had vanished beneath a pristine, deceptive layer of snow. The woods ahead were smooth and untouched, as if the storm had deliberately concealed whatever happened there. Lieutenant Danilov knelt beside a mound of snow, brushing away ice with stiff fingers. "This was not like yesterday," he murmured. "There should be some sign. Even in a storm this strong." Mallory nodded grimly. Soviet units had made similar observations throughout the winter. Some storms were strong enough to blur footprints, but it was unusual to find sections of terrain so thoroughly smoothed over that even depressions from trees or rocks were half-filled. It created the unsettling impression that the land itself had shifted. With no radio contact, the set badly damaged by ice during the night, the platoon relied on compass bearings and memory. Their first objective was clear: search for the missing men and recover any equipment lost during the blizzard. They began with a slow sweep of the immediate area, probing snowbanks with bayonets. Every few minutes, Hero paused to listen. "Quiet," he'd say. "Too quiet." Even birds, normally active after storms, were absent. The only sound was the brittle creaking of ice in the canopy above. An hour into their search, one of Danilov's scouts called out sharply. Beneath a shallow drift lay fragments of a wireless set. The metal casing was dented, the wires frayed and exposed. Roth examined it carefully. "Not ours," she concluded. "Ours is intact, just frozen." Danilov turned the fragment over, wiping away snow. It bore British markings. "Could belong to one of the missing," Mallory said. "But why is it this far off from our shelter?" Hero frowned. "Unless someone moved during the night. Or unless the wind carried it," Danilov added, though even he seemed unconvinced. "The storm could move equipment, yes, but rarely in such a straight, isolated deposit." More unsettling was the second discovery: shell casings. 3 of them, partially buried in the snow. British .303 caliber. Fired recently. "Someone fired during the storm," Roth whispered. "One of ours." "And no German casings?" Hero asked. Danilov shook his head. "None." The implication hung in the air. If a British soldier fired his weapon, who, or what, had he been firing at in the blizzard's blinding chaos? The group pressed onward, expanding the search radius. The forest grew denser, the snow deeper. Danilov pointed out a series of broken branches overhead. "Something large moved through here," he said. "A man. Maybe more." But again, no footprints. No drag marks. Nothing that could confirm human presence. That was when they found the second clue: a torn section of British uniform fabric caught on a low branch. It was ice-stiff, shredded, stained with a smear of frozen blood. Mallory's jaw clenched. This was no hallucination. One of his men had passed this way, and not long ago. But the blood trail did not continue. The snow around it was undisturbed, soft and smooth. "We're missing the whole story," Mallory finally said. "Something happened here in the storm. Something violent. But the snow has hidden all of it." As if punctuating his words, a distant cracking sound echoed through the trees, like a heavy weight settling on ice. Everyone froze. Danilov raised a fist, signaling silence. The cracking repeated, sharper this time. Not gunfire. Not branches. Something shifting beneath the snow. Something large. The platoon instinctively raised their rifles. Hero mouthed silently. "Germans." Danilov shook his head. "Germans leave tracks." The sound stopped abruptly. The forest returned to stillness. With daylight fading and uncertainty thickening, Mallory called a halt to the search. "We regroup at WWII," he ordered. "We recover, then reassess. Whatever happened here isn't finished." They began the trek back, slower this time, more aware of the silence pressing in around them. Behind them, the pristine snow remained unbroken, untouched, unrevealing. It held whatever answers the storm had buried. Somewhere within that frozen landscape lay the fate of the missing men. And the search that would follow, involving Soviet and NKVD units, would uncover even more unsettling evidence, none of it leading to a clear explanation. The snowstorm had erased the battlefield. But it had not erased the truth, just the trail that led to it. In the days that followed the storm, the Voibokolo sector became the focus of one of the most intensive small unit searches conducted by Soviet frontline forces during that phase of the Leningrad campaign. What began as a simple attempt to recover a missing British liaison platoon evolved into a broader investigation, one that raised more questions than it answered. Mallory's reduced team, now under strict watch by NKVD border troops arriving from the 21st Division Detachment, was ordered to retrace their steps with guidance from Soviet officers who wanted answers just as much as Mallory did. Too many oddities had surfaced in the wake of the storm. Too many contradictions. And too many gaps that defied the typical patterns of Eastern Front combat. On February 5th, the search expanded south and east of the forest where the torn uniform fabric and shell casings had been found. NKVD Captain Pavel Andreev took operational command. He was direct, disciplined, and skeptical of initial reports. "Men do not simply disappear," he said during the morning briefing. "They leave traces, blood, weapons, equipment, even footprints if briefly." Mallory agreed, though the evidence he had already seen contradicted Andreev's confidence. The NKVD teams fanned out in tight formations, their submachine guns angled low. They were experienced trackers, accustomed to locating infiltrators, deserters, and German reconnaissance detachments. But even they found the terrain unsettling. The deep drifts, sculpted by the storm, looked almost manufactured, smooth and uniform in areas that should have exhibited wind scars, uneven ridges, and debris. Andreev knelt at one point, sifting snow through his gloves. "Too soft," he muttered. As if it fell after the wind had already stopped. The first major discovery of the day came shortly before noon. A Soviet scout found a depression in the snow, barely perceptible, but distinct enough to indicate something had been buried and then partially revealed by a shift in the drift. Digging carefully, the men uncovered a British-issue entrenching tool and a single glove still retaining body warmth. Hero turned the glove over in his hands, recognizing the initials sewn inside, TK, Trooper Kent. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, no equipment nearby. Just a glove, inexplicably preserved, as though Kent had dropped it minutes, not days, earlier. The discovery raised tension among the searchers. Some Soviet scouts exchanged uneasy glances, muttering theories. Germans operating unseen in the storm. A Soviet artillery barrage that might have inadvertently scattered the platoon. Even the possibility of a roving penal unit known for taking supplies from both Soviet and German forces. Andreev dismissed most of these suggestions. "If it was a penal team," he said bluntly, "we would find bodies. They take supplies, not prisoners." By mid-afternoon, Danilov spotted something more substantial. A shallow indentation in a snowbank appearing to be the remains of a collapsed foxhole. Inside lay a cluster of German equipment. An ammunition pouch, a canteen marked with the insignia of the 96th Infantry Regiment, and a broken entrenching tool that seemed to have snapped under force. But again, there was no blood. No footprints. No frozen remains. Hero examined the items with growing unease. This wasn't abandoned in a hurry. Someone placed it here. As the search widened, competing theories emerged. Danilov believed the platoon had been caught between retreating German units and a Soviet bombardment. "A storm makes men run blind," he said. "It would be easy to stumble into the wrong lines." But Andreev found evidence that complicated this view. Shards of metal lodged in nearby trees indicated fire from the west, not the east, suggesting that any engagement had involved German forces firing toward the storm, not away from it. Compounding the confusion were contradictory reports from nearby Soviet units. One outpost claimed they heard machine gun fire late on February 3rd, though they attributed it initially to German harassment. Another said they heard nothing at all. No gunfire, no shouting, no unusual movement. Yet their positions were separated by less than 2 kilometers. Late that afternoon, The search party encountered a final, unsettling clue. Near the edge of a frozen marshland, embedded in a crust of refrozen snow, lay a single British Lee-Enfield rifle. It was upright, its stock embedded in the ice, barrel pointing toward the tree line. The weapon was clean, unfired, and free of snow accumulation, indicating it had been placed there after the storm. Harrow approached it slowly, as though wary of breaking the stillness around it. "This is staged," he said softly. "Someone wanted it found." Andreev narrowed his eyes. "By whom? Germans? Stragglers? Or one of your missing men?" Mallory didn't answer. The rifle's placement defied logic. Soldiers fleeing danger rarely planted weapons carefully upright. It looked more like a signal, a signpost, a marker, or an unfinished attempt at communication interrupted before completion. As daylight faded and a creeping frost overtook the area, Andreev ordered the search suspended until morning. The NKVD officers collected the recovered equipment, tagging it for transport to command. Mallory lingered briefly at the edge of the marsh, staring at the rifle. It stood like a silent sentry, an unanswered question rising from the frozen earth. The day's findings raised more uncertainty than clarity. There were signs of struggle, but no bodies. Evidence of movement, but no tracks. German gear, but no German casualties. British equipment scattered as though dropped deliberately, or carried by forces unknown. And somewhere in that frozen wilderness, 4 of Mallory's men remained unaccounted for. The storm had taken their footprints. The forest had taken their trail. But the truth, Mallory sensed, was still out there, buried beneath layers of snow and silence. Tomorrow's search would go deeper. And what they uncovered next would force Soviet and British investigators alike to reassess everything they believed had happened in those fateful hours. By February 7, 1943, the formal search for the missing British liaison platoon had expanded beyond the immediate Voibokolo sector. Soviet command, now pressured by both the Leningrad front headquarters and British representatives in the city, authorized an extended sweep by combined elements of the 55th Army, NKVD border troops, and dedicated Soviet sapper teams. The goal was no longer simply to recover lost soldiers. It was to understand what had happened. Why no bodies, no consistent tracks, and no coherent battlefield evidence had surfaced after the blizzard. What remained was a puzzle with pieces that refused to fit together. As daylight broke, the temperature hovered near -30 degrees Celsius. The snow glistened with the harsh clarity that often follows major storms, making every indentation and irregularity stand out sharply. NKVD Captain Pavel Andreev reorganized the search teams along a grid pattern, marking each section with stakes and colored cloth to ensure nothing was overlooked. At Mallory's request, one grid line cut directly across the area where the upright Lee-Enfield rifle had been found. "If anything points to the men's direction," he told Andreev, "it's that rifle. Someone placed it deliberately." The sweep began with slow, methodical precision. Men walked shoulder to shoulder, probing snowbanks with bayonets and listening for hollow echoes that might signal buried equipment. Soviet sappers examined sections of frozen marshland, tapping long-handled mallets against the ice surface. Once in a while the mallet struck something hard, rocks, tree trunks, old shell fragments, but never anything human. Mallory walked alongside Harrow and Danilov, scanning the tree line. Several times he paused, peering into the forest as though expecting to see movement. "You hear that?" he asked at one point. Harrow listened closely. Only wind rustled through the pines. "Thought I heard boots," Mallory muttered. "Heavy ones." Danilov frowned. "This forest plays tricks after storms. Echoes travel strangely here." Wordlessly, Mallory acknowledged the warning. At midday, a Soviet scout from the southern sweep shouted for attention. The search party converged on the location, a shallow depression surrounded by drifts. The scout pointed to an elongated mound where the snow bulged subtly upward. Digging carefully, the men revealed a collapsed German field shelter. Inside lay a rusted stove, a ration tin, and a blood-stained scrap of wool cloth. But the blood was old, frozen long before the storm. Danilov quickly dismissed it as unrelated. "This position was abandoned weeks ago," he said. "Not part of our missing men." The disappointment was palpable. Every clue so far had led only to dead ends or contradictions. Still, the search pressed on. Shortly after 1300 hours, another discovery emerged, this time from an NKVD patrol sweeping a ridge north of the marsh. Half buried in a snowdrift was a Soviet identification tag and a small notebook. Andreev examined it closely. The notebook belonged to a Red Army soldier reported missing in December, weeks before Mallory's platoon arrived. "This area has history," Andreev said quietly. "Storms take many. But even those men usually leave more behind." Mallory agreed. Yet the find only broadened the mystery rather than narrowing it. As the team regrouped at the marsh edge, Hero noticed something unusual, a faint series of shallow depressions leading away from the cluster of trees. Not footprints exactly, more like irregular compressions, softened by days of snowfall. "These aren't natural," he said. "Someone or something moved through here after the storm, but before the surface refroze." Andreev ordered the depressions followed. The line wound north, bending through the forest in a path too straight to be random but too faint to be certain. After nearly a kilometer, they reached the base of a low hill. There, beneath a thin crust of ice, lay a scattering of artifacts: a torn khaki strap from a British rucksack, a frozen piece of chocolate from a standard-issue ration tin, and fragments of a Soviet map case. But again, no bodies, no weapons, no tracks. The items appeared almost placed. "This suggests they were together," Danilov said. "You're missing men. Maybe moving with one of ours." Andreev countered. "Or they were moved. These items are too close together. Too tidy." A growing sense of unease settled over the group. The forest seemed painfully quiet. Even the wind had stilled. With daylight waning, Andreev called for the final sweep of the day, a wide arc around the base of the hill. Sappers probed the ground. Scouts scanned the tree line. Nothing. No sign of struggle. No sign of encirclement. No sign of German ambush or Soviet-friendly fire. No evidence of retreat or desertion. It was as though the missing men had simply walked out of the war. As the party prepared to withdraw, Mallory remained standing at the crest of the hill, staring out over the frozen expanse. Hero approached him quietly. "Sir, we can resume tomorrow. Fresh men, better visibility." Mallory didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy. "If they were killed, there would be bodies. If they were captured, there would be tracks. If they fled, we'd find a direction." He paused, exhaling a long plume of frozen breath. "No unit vanishes without a trace. Not even in a storm like that." Andreev, overhearing, stepped closer. "Some events remain unresolved, Captain. War creates silences that history cannot easily fill." Mallory nodded slowly, though his expression remained troubled. The search party moved off, their figures descending the hill one by one, small silhouettes swallowed by the trees and fading light. In the days that followed, the official inquiry would produce only fragments. Contradictory unit reports, scattered equipment, conflicting witness statements, and one unnerving meteorological record describing the storm as unpredictable, disorienting, unusually intense. The file on the British platoon remained open for months, then years, before being quietly sealed without conclusion. No bodies were ever found. No definitive explanation emerged. The platoon became one more unsolved footnote in the vast, frozen ledger of the Eastern Front. Men lost not to myth or legend, but to the relentless chaos of war and winter. And long after the fields thawed and the forests returned to green, the story of the lost platoon of Leningrad remained a question buried beneath snow and silence. One that still lingers in the archives as a reminder of how easily history can erase even the most determined men.